Hello, friends. I am Brenda Bailey Hughes, and I'm here with my colleague, Brian Hathaway. Dr. Hathaway has been the CEO and founder of a really interesting organization called Middle Turtle. And this organization helps people explore careers with social impact. And so for those of you who are on the job hunt right now, maybe you've just graduated from college, maybe you're making a job transition, I want you to tune in and learn a lot from our guest. Brian, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brenda.
Absolutely. Before we even get started with my first real question, I would love to know about the name origin, Middle Turtle. Where did this come from?
Yes, I get that question a lot. It's a fair question. I think the short version of it is there's this idea that you can hear in different stories that the world sits on the back of a turtle, of its shell. And as the story goes, someone says, well, what is the turtle on? And someone says another turtle. And what's that turtle on? And the punchline is usually there's turtles all the way down. And for my purposes, the reason the business is called Middle Turtle is that logic kind of matters in careers where a lot of times we're told to search for something really essential about ourselves or foundational. And where we push people at Middle Turtle is to think more of who we are as being shaped by a lot of different forces, right? So shaped by prior experience, shaped by the values of our culture, shaped by our own personality, certainly, but not building towards an understanding of yourself as fixed and there's some sort of pure essential version of yourself. It's getting comfortable with that idea that we're the sum of a lot of different influences, and it might be productive to reflect on those various influences and how they interact with each other.
How interesting. So that I don't have to find the perfect me or the perfect job for me or the perfect role for me, because there's a lot of influences of what me is then.
Absolutely. That's right.
How interesting. I know that a lot of what Middle Turtle talks about, though, is being purpose driven. So I know I have had you do some teaching at Kelly. I know you do some at Kelly School of Business at Indiana University. Brian does instructional design with the Wharton School. I've taught at the Kelly School. I know when I've given some career coaching to students in the past, it's like frequently they have this long list of criteria, maybe someplace geographically that they kind of need to stay in or want to be in. And they have what their degree has prepared them for and what their experiences have prepared them for. And they have, some financial and benefit criteria for themselves. And they might have some criteria about how fast they can promote. And then when I look at them, or I imagine if someone you looks at them and says, oh, hey, by the way, you also want to have a job that has deep meaning for you, that has purpose. It's like I could kind of see them freaking out, like, oh my gosh, one more thing on the criteria list here of what I have to find in a job. How do you talk about meaningful work in a way that doesn't just stress people out even more than all the other things they're already looking for?
No, that's exactly right. I think that people understandably have some anxiety about the idea of doing purposeful or meaningful work. It can feel like something that is only accessible to a privileged few. It can feel like something that is only accessible to people who are dedicating their entire lives to some lofty cause. And certainly Middle Turtle advocates pushing in the direction of, first of all, finding more ways to create meaning locally. So even in a job that might be what I would call a more conventional role, there are a lot of opportunities to create meaning together, right? By being a good manager, by taking pride in making an organizational process better, even can be a very meaningful activity. I should plug one of my friends, Rachel Pacheco, from my PhD program, is now a professor at Georgetown and has a book on this very topic coming out in the fall. So I'm very excited about that. And I think that's one direction that's really important to recognize, is that this is not something that is an all or nothing, completely objective, separate thing that someone would do from a quote unquote normal job. And so once you can look past that and find more helpful ways of exploring purpose and meaning, the second big shift is that it is not something you figure out on your own. So you mentioned the tendency of people, and I should admit to this tendency myself, of making these lists of criteria, trying to find the objective right answer on a piece of paper to how purpose or meaning, a fulfilling career could be created, right? And again, what I preach and increasingly practice is that this is something co-created. It's something that involves a lot of contact with other people and working with other people to understand their perspective. And long story short, on the other side of it, it's true that, I think some of what people in our community do would meet that initial criterion of being this kind of lofty, big goal in their life, but it comes from a different place. A lot of times those goals can come from a place of ego, of needing to feel important, right? It's another form of competition in a career that mine is more purposeful for you. And on the other side of that social process is meaning that's derived from taking pride in the contributions you're making to other people's lives in a less ego-driven place.
You said that this process of getting to this discernment process is co-created. It's a social process. Can you give us an example of what that looks like? I mean, aside from, hey, I talk to my best friends in my inner circle to say, what do you see me doing? What does that co-creation process entail to some extent?
Right, absolutely. So it's kind of an amalgamation of different techniques, but one that comes pretty intuitively is this idea of looping or gisting. It's called different things in different contexts, but to draw the contrast out, what I'm not advocating would be writing a list yourself or throwing it into ChatGPT and seeing if it seems to be the right answer. A process of looping or gisting might be that you start with that list and then you start running it by people. You start testing it out and having them read it back to you, right? So, okay, what I'm hearing is this, or what stands out to you about this? Could you summarize back my own goal in your words? And then you have this process of kind of verifying, oh yeah, that sounded right, or no, it didn't. You can see that it's a more interactive process. And if you structure this the right way, it can be really interesting, right? So an example of this would be when I started Middle Turtle, which admittedly was starting in a very abstract headspace, right? Coming out of a PhD program, I would have people explain to me what they thought Middle Turtle was. And some of it was exactly what I said, but I was interested that a lot of times it was not at all what I had in mind. And some of those gave me ways I could sharpen how I presented myself. And then some of them actually had good ideas for how to build on the ideas I was working with at the time. And so it's a very generative, collaborative process, right? That's one technique that you can use within this broader process and mentality of navigating this together rather than in isolation.
I love that. I'm thinking of unintentional career advice that I've received through the years from just good listening partners who reflected back what they were hearing me say. And I could hear myself so much clearer when it came through a trusted mentor or friend's voice sometimes. So very interesting. Well, I started by asking about a person who actually doesn't want to think about social meaning because it might stress them out. On the other hand, we have people who very much feel a pull, a tug towards something bigger in their life, something more than just making a paycheck or, making the rich person richer kind of thing.
Mhm.
I'm curious when someone feels that tug, but it's very ambiguous still. They still can't give it much of a name. How do you help that person? Do you work with them, or are most of the people that end up in your space kind of already clear that I want more social impact, or I want it, and here's how I'm going to do it? What do you do with the people who want to have a meaningful career but don't even know what that would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is more the sweet spot of where we work. And Middle Turtle really, I think the seeds of it were planted back when I was a college sophomore and having those feelings of that you described, or even as an MBA student at Indiana University, I want to make my mark on the world. I want to help the world, but it's this vague, unfocused sensibility that, what I observe among undergraduate students in particular, but you see a similar process playing out at MBAs or other careers, is everyone comes in wanting to change the world. They've just written their college essays about changing the world. And in the freshman year, you have idealistic, kind of peppy people. And then something happens in the middle of that process. And we end up with a lot of investment bankers and management consultants who don't like their jobs very much. And nothing against those professions specifically. My critique has been always focused on that process of not being able to explore these kind of fuzzier, off the beaten path careers in social impact, as well as you can explore careers that are high status, very socially validated. And that looks different depending on what the campus is and the degree program is. I think to answer the actual question about how that person would go through it, one is just building on the answer from earlier. Don't think of this as something where you need to figure it out. There is one right answer out there to be found, and you are solely responsible. It's more about developing the habits of building your career in collaboration with others who probably share some important values of yours, but can also challenge you in important ways. And, for the college sophomore that I just mentioned, an example of how that would look would be, instead of spending your evenings, just doing internet research about different careers or looking at job boards, you would establish a practice of having 3 coffee chats per week, right? One with a peer, one with an alumnus of your school, and one from whoever you can find online who seems to be doing interesting work, and really be more diligent about using conversations to propel forward that interest, to refine it over time, which has a nice byproduct of building your professional relationships in a space where a lot of people are also interested in what you're interested in.
I love that idea. I've seen too many students and career shifters that get in almost this spiral of, I'm online taking the personality test, and I'm taking my strengths finder test, and I'm doing, I'm doing
Yeah.
all the pros, I'm making all the pros and cons lists. And how much more valuable might it just be to have a conversation with a real human who understands me a little bit, or understands the kinds of values and pathway that I might want to take. Plus, I think, like you said, it does build your network, but in such a organic way. Students and job changers, I think, hate networking because it always feels like it feels like I'm using someone. It feels
Right.
so right.
Absolutely. Yes.
And if we take that out, I'm not here to ask for a job. I'm just here to get your insights on things. It takes all that pressure off of being in a networking coffee chat conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm one of those people where early in my career, I would have said, I hate networking. This feels gross. It feels transactional. It
Yes.
feels a lot different when you're authentically exploring an interest. You tend to be better about following up. You tend to have better conversations, ask more interesting conversations, and it doesn't feel like a transactional thing, because it isn't. And then if you do it long enough, those things that you were, might be after in a more conventional way, like a job or clarity on what your next professional step is, tend to emerge from those conversations and those relationships that you're building in a way that would not be possible, again, sitting in the corner, sitting on the couch with a notepad, trying to figure it all out yourself.
Oh, that's a great tip. Three coffee chats schedule them, do them. So
Or more.
healthy.
Yeah. I mean, it could look different depending on what your situation is. Maybe you don't like coffee, maybe whatever, right? But something like that to really get the engines going and get a process that you stick to of socializing your interests, basically.
I'm going to start asking friends to take walks that are with an agenda. My agenda is to talk about career. Let's go. Let's talk about these things. I love that. I think we have probably some people listening who have felt that tug, maybe they want to move in a way that feels more meaningful to them, whatever that looks like, because you've said that that's got a lot of shapes. It seems like there might be 2 different camps of those people, at least, probably a dozen. Those who want to find that or need to find that meaning in their current role. And I love the example that you gave of, okay, then be a great manager who makes the lives of all of your team better because of the kind of team you build. I mean, that's a great example of creating meaning, regardless of what the mission of my organization is. I am still creating meaning. So we've got that. I need to do it within the job. And then I think we have people who are like, I've got a side hustle idea here that is really where my meaning comes from. And I want to talk to both of those groups. Let's start with the ones that are probably going to stay in current role.
Mm-hmm.
What are there other ways to create meaning and stay right where I am today?
Absolutely. So for the first group that sees a pathway to creating more meaning on the job, a lot of this distinction between social impact and more conventional careers dissolves upon close scrutiny. It's really all about finding different ways to make a positive impact on other people and having those contributions be recognized, right? So sometimes Middle Turtle uses the language of social impact or social entrepreneur, but it's not at all necessary. And there are many ways of being entrepreneurial within a job, right? So again, entrepreneurship, we think of as leaving a job to start a company, that sort of administrative process of forming your own company. I tend to think of it more as a mindset. And so to give an example of how you might create meaning by being entrepreneurial on the job is to start testing hypotheses, basically, right? So for me, building Middle Turtle is not so much about the mechanics of starting a company or calling myself CEO. It's about exploring different hypotheses and testing them, right? Any business is this bundle of ideas with different strands that you can pull apart and pick apart and test and improve over time. And that process is entirely available to you within a job that you like well enough to put forth more effort into, right? So it could be that you have an idea for how to be a better manager. It could be that you have an idea for how the business can do something better. And you can push yourself to start thinking like an entrepreneur, building those mental habits of distilling the big idea into a set of testable hypotheses, socializing them, testing them, refining them. All of that feels very rewarding. And in many ways, it's a lot more comfortable to do it within a job with more structure than actually starting your own company, right?
Absolutely. Let's imagine that I have this great dream of what I want to do with my life, but in reality, that dream doesn't make any money, and I got a family to support today. I need to stay in the job that I'm in. Give that listener some ideas on how to persist in the reality that they're in for right now.
Right. And I think that's the situation you described is probably characteristic of more people in our economy than the other situation of having the flexibility financially and otherwise to take on a big risk. You can't just declare that, sorry, I care about innovation or social impact now, so I'm not paying my mortgage, right? People have obligations, and that's completely understandable. I think when you feel like stuck has a negative connotation, but let's just say there's a hard constraint in the way you described. There's still more room to maneuver than people might think if you zoom out and think of your career as a piece of what you're really optimizing for, which is the life you're building, right? So when I myself have felt that pinch of wanting to do something but not being able to, for me, it generated a lot of negative feelings. And I think in hindsight, I would have approached it and looked at it differently. So as long as that broader project of making a contribution through your life to people around you, whether that's family, your community, friends, coworkers, or something kind of more scaled, for lack of a better word, all of those are perfectly legitimate options. And even if you have a hard constraint in one area of your life, there's probably compensating freedom in other areas of your life. If you have time to develop a hobby or volunteer on a nonprofit board, which is how you and I met, or even within a job that has some challenging aspects to it, finding different ways of coping, relating to people, and improving the culture of your organization. There doesn't need to be more than that, basically. And so a lot of the recommendations for people in that situation is actually to let go of the pressure to do something that we feel like is more legacy defining, right?
Yeah.
That your legacy is secure as long as you're, a person who shows up and tries to make the world a better place in whatever large or small ways are available to you that day. I think that's enough. And sometimes the resentment can set in when people aren't willing to accept that that's enough, that they feel like there has to be this bigger thing that they bring into the world.
I love that. Let go of the pressure of this legacy career. Instead, just show up, the people around me right here in my existing role, make life a little better for them, or make the people that that paycheck is supporting, make their life a little bit better, and call it a day. Say, this is a pretty good gig right here. My work here is done. I like that. I'm curious now, let's talk about people who do have an idea, a big idea that they want to launch in a very entrepreneurial sort of way. I know that Middle Turtle started out as a big idea. In your own experience and advice that you would give to others, how do you start leaning into making the big idea more than an idea, but in a way that doesn't make you risk everything you have?
Right, absolutely. It's important this depends a bit on your life situation, like the opportunity costs that you individually face in that moment, right? So for me, starting this business in my mid late 30s, there are some ways in which I can be more bold and risk taking. And there are some ways where I'm constrained, right, in terms of time or money and obligations that I'm very happy to have, but it's just a phase of life thing. So it depends a bit on the situation. But regardless of your individual situation, think back to that idea of entrepreneurship as testing a bundle of hypotheses, right? It's not just one big idea, it's a series of ideas that interact with one another in interesting and important ways and can individually be tested, right? So one way to reduce risk is to identify those smaller ideas that add up to the big idea and test them individually. So here again, I have to acknowledge one of my mentors, Tyler Rye, I was his teaching assistant for many years at Wharton, and kind of got this drilled into my head. And many of the entrepreneurs who would come through our classes would have stories of doing this really effectively. Is that if it feels risky, you need to find ways of testing assumptions in your model without taking on the full risk that comes with. I mean, I can't tell you when you start a company how many different administrative and legal and accounting things. It's just an absolute nightmare, right? So what's important is to test those ideas, and many times you'll get feedback on the idea where the company you end up starting, there's a like abstract conceptual core that is related to your original idea, but the manifestation of it in a company is totally different. And it's, if you can get some of that learning and pain out of the way before you take the leap and start having that clock ticking in your head or your financial runway burning up, it tends to go much better.
You mentioned that you heard lots of stories about how people unpacked these conglomeration of ideas to be able to test one hypothesis or one small idea at a time. Can you recall any of those specific stories to give us an example, a concrete example of testing a singular hypothesis that's part of a grander idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can actually probably most concretely speak to Middle Turtle's own journey as a company as an example of the broader point. And for me, I started this company in 2023. And that was a really interesting time to start a company because of the emergence of these AI tools. And we're still learning what all the effects are, for better or worse, of those. But I think for Middle Turtle, it really shook things up in terms of certain things becoming viable that may not have been viable before as an entrepreneur, and then certain ideas for the business no longer being viable, or at least no longer necessary. So the original concept for Middle Turtle was sort of an information platform for careers and social impact. And that's an example of an idea for a business that may have actually worked at a certain time in a certain place, but with the emergence of these tools, probably is less viable. So what's changing is the time and the external environment, where these AI tools over time will be able to provide a lot of information that platform would have provided. In fact, the AI tools would have gobbled up that information probably and regurgitated it as its own. So that is freeing in a way, because you can trust that certain types of information are easier to find than they were a year or two ago. But as an entrepreneur, I also have to focus on the opportunity that comes with that, or what gaps are remaining, where in a world where you imagine someone has perfect information at their fingertips, what's still missing? And thankfully for my business, at least, I think what's really essential and still missing from interacting with AI tools and from situations where you have a lot of information at your fingertips is that social component, where you're testing hypotheses, you're getting moral support, and so on, in a community that is not possible to recreate through technology alone. So that's what we focus on.
I love my chat or my Claude or my whatever AI tool I'm using as a thought partner, but it is
Yeah.
not the same as a community of real brainstormers and listeners and conversationalists. Yeah, we're still not there, are we? You mentioned AI, and I know that a lot of your thought work has been sort of this intersection of technology and philosophy. I'm curious if you have thoughts about how corporations are using AI right now, maybe particularly in the career, HR, learning and development space. Are they making mistakes that you would call out? Are they getting it right? What opportunities do you see? Talk to us just a little bit about AI in the current corporate space.
Right. It's hard to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think that at a high level, AI tools can be very useful for getting people's jobs done. But what they don't do as well is creating that human connection, right? Just like I was talking about with building a company, a lot of issues of organizational culture boil down to trust and camaraderie among a group of people working together. And that's the area where, I mean, these are still early days. So we'll see what happens, but there's a real need and opportunity to create organizations where you have these cultural attributes that are so important, right? Psychological safety, being willing to speak up if you observe something and have that not punished by the organization formally or informally. The ability to meet new people across your organization and collaborate and have kind of informal run-ins. My sense is that this first wave of AI scooping up a lot of transactional low-hanging fruit, right? So just making people faster at their jobs or automating tasks. So there's economic value in that. But the types of problems that interest me more about organizations are, how do you have people really meshing as a group and collaborating well? And I haven't seen much evidence that AI tools are being used productively on that front yet.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. I'm going to take us back to more career oriented. I'd seen that question. I was almost going to cut it because it didn't fit with our career focus, but you mentioned it, and I thought I bet there are some good nuggets there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can, now that we're in a pause,
Yeah.
Middle Turtle actually last summer I almost like started working with a big company on that exact issue. So there's a different world where I would have had a lot more to say, but again, it's early days, so
Early
focusing
days.
more on the entrepreneurial side or early career side now. But yeah, whatever will
Okay.
resonate.
This is lovely that I can take a minute and just kind of glance at where we are and where I want to go next. I'm not used to this because live, we just have to roll. Let's see. We talked about being good manager. Is there a way to use a launching pad? We kind of caught that. Okay, I'm going to pick up with a couple of just maybe one and maybe a follow up on sort of that entrepreneurial experience, actually starting your own thing.
Sure.
And then we'll move into hope. And I say hope lab, but I have had some interesting conversations about hope, and I'm interested in your spin on it. So, all right. I know that some of our listeners have a side hustle that they're sitting on, something they really believe in, something they want to see come to fruition. What is the most honest advice you can give them about getting that rolling?
Yeah. The most honest advice I could give an aspiring entrepreneur is that no one's going to care more about your venture than you. And many times in the early days, it feels like no one cares except you. And it's fundamentally a very challenging thing, right? The numbers are scary on entrepreneurship. Everyone's kind of excited about these big outcomes, but most new businesses do not get very far. And so some of that Middle Turtle is trying to remedy by giving more social support to the early stage. And so when you think about this kind of harsh truth that the market doesn't care, your friends and family may be confused or threatened by it, or people at your job you're leaving might say, why are you doing this, and feel threatened by it. I think it's important to find a community of people who is grappling with some of the similar problems. So I've been very grateful to a couple different entrepreneurial communities that I'm part of, especially here locally in Bloomington, Indiana, with the Mill, that just has a monthly meetup to be able to talk through your problems. And building an early stage organization is a lot different than a conventional job. It kind of flexes different muscles than you're used to flexing in a job. And it's very challenging, to be honest. But that can also make it very rewarding when you start to see glimmers of something that exists in the world that would not have existed but for your effort and perseverance.
What if I am out there trying to make a go of this idea that I truly believe in, that I think is genius. And I have been at it a while and I'm just not getting any traction. I have these dreams of, or maybe I'm even just dreaming of, I can make this role that I'm currently in within my more traditional job setting. I can make it meaningful, but every day I feel flat. When does this become delusion, and how do we know the difference? When is there a time to give up, and how do we know that? I had a social gathering recently, and a friend said, I feel sort of naive or stupid even being hopeful some days. How do you deal with the question mark of hope?
Yes, hope is really essential. And it's a wonderful observation that in certain moments it can be hard to distinguish from delusion. I think that, first of all, when to set aside an entrepreneurial idea is often a question that is answered just by constrained resources, right? So people run out of money, they run out of time, they run out of patience from their spouse or whatever it may be, right? If you're in that kind of floating along phase, it's a little harder to say because there's no burning platform forcing you to set aside the idea, but it can feel like languishing. But I've always believed that hope is a really essential ingredient for entrepreneurs and anyone building their career, especially in the early days. And the reason is, first of all, hope is intimately related to the belief that you have the ability to make a difference in the world. And so when people get discouraged about what's in the news or, oh, AI is going to take my job, some of the most corrosive effects are on that belief. And so really tending to that belief, finding people who will reinforce that belief that you have in yourself is an essential part of the process, right? And I always think of Leslie Odom Jr., the actor, wrote a wonderful memoir. And he, before Hamilton really revitalized his career, was on the verge of quitting. And his father-in-law gave him advice that was along the lines of, I'd love to see you try before you quit. And Leslie Odom Jr. was offended by this advice at first, but as he thought about it and kind of understood what he meant, really took a lot of inspiration from that. And his mentor's point was, have you really done everything you can? Are you going to the coffee shops and singing 5 days a week instead of just sitting around and waiting for the phone to ring, right? Are you really meeting new people and sharing your talents? So the analog to that for entrepreneurs would be, instead of hoping for investment to appear or hoping that people will start visiting the website, it may be a matter of digging deep and thinking very creatively about, how can I just really push and get myself out there in a way that, maybe in the past I was hoping it would all just click, right? That's actually very rare that it just clicks. Yeah. And it often takes a long time of the struggle beforehand. But Great. It's hard to say. It's a very individual decision. And my sense is actually that people tend to give up too early. They take the plunge, they do all the hard stuff, and then they can't quite stick with the process long enough to come out the other side. But that's a very general observation.
And so as our wrap-up question here then, for the person listening who feels that they're just almost at wit's end, they've been either on a job hunt for too long, or they've been nurturing and trying to get traction on an important idea to them in that entrepreneurial space for too long, or they've had hope that this organization I work in is going to be a place where I can make things better, and I still don't feel it. What's your strong word for them? What's a good word for them? What do you have to say to them? And where could Middle Turtle be helpful to them?
Sure, absolutely. So for the first question, if you're really at wit's end, one of the best things that I think you can do is to revisit some of the assumptions that are governing your actions, right? So it could work in either direction. It could be that a mission is really important to you and you assume that you need to be an entrepreneur to achieve that, but that if you let go of that second assumption about how you will pursue that, your sort of project in life, a lot of other opportunities open up and you can kind of set aside the venture more easily. Conversely, someone might have to leave their job to start a company. There are many companies that have been started because people just couldn't quite get people on board at their company and knew that there's all this inertia and things like that come with mature companies. So another piece of advice I'll give is to distinguish hope from optimism. So if you think of optimism as the belief that things will go well or get better, hope does not necessarily require that. It's more about, even in the toughest circumstances, preserving a belief that in some small way, you will be able to make the world better other than it would have been otherwise. And so that can be really galvanizing. And in some of the more challenging moments that I've observed with entrepreneurs, it's conflating the two that's really dangerous, right? So if things are not going well, you can lose optimism on something, but not lose hope in your project. As for Middle Turtle, we're always happy to connect with people kind of wrestling with questions of social impact and meaning at work. We tend to specialize in helping undergraduates go full time with their social entrepreneurial ideas, again, as a counterbalance to many campus cultures that steer people towards more conventional careers. But my big goal with Middle Turtle is to build an online learning community. And so in that sense, there's no price of admission in terms of occupation or anything like that. If you're curious about these topics, go to middleturtle.com or find me on LinkedIn and we'll start learning together.
Brian, thank you so much for these great thoughts.
It was my pleasure, Brenda. Thanks for having me.